Let's now take a closer look at the Declaration of Independence. We'll start with the title. It begins in Congress, July 4th, 1776, the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. Just in that title alone, we see the new name of the country, the 13 United States of America, and the word unanimous. All 13 are in agreement. The introduction begins in this way. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So already Thomas Jefferson is saying it becomes necessary. Now this word was very important in the 18th century. The word necessary meant that this was like law. You didn't have a choice. It was required. And so he chooses this word carefully. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another people. Notice he doesn't say who. He's not pointing fingers yet. He's simply making a declaration. To assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. He's basically saying that the United States will be equal to other nations. But a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. They're going to declare independence, but they're also going to explain why it is necessary. As we move on in the Declaration, we come to the Preamble. Now, this preamble is quite famous, and it also uses words that were borrowed from John Locke. Jefferson begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," meaning anyone would agree. These are the truths. Number one, that all men are created equal. It's interesting that he uses the word men here. He doesn't say that all humans are created equal. Now, Jefferson was a slave owner. He already knew that in his household, not everyone was equal. So when he says that all men are created equal, he means very specific men. White European men who own property. Poor men who do not own property, they're not included. Non-whites, not included. Women, not included. Certain men are created equal. That these men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, meaning rights that cannot be taken away. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now remember, Locke had said life, liberty, and property. Locke had argued that it was the right of every person to own property. But in Jefferson's household, where there are slaves, clearly some people do not have the right to own property. So he changes it, and he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All people ought to be able to pursue happiness. He continues that to secure those rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now you'll remember from Locke, we had heard these words before. Consent of the governed. The people who are governed give their consent to be governed. The preamble continues. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. So when there's a long train of abuses, all of them contributing to the same thing, despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. From that point on, the document then begins to explain all the things that George III had done, a series of injustices that Jefferson presents as facts. There are 28 evidences against George III. We won't go into all of these, of course. Instead, let's hit on some of the main themes. Number one, he begins by saying that George III had abused his executive power and had removed justice from the colonies. George III had also permitted unconstitutional laws. A third claim is that he had conducted violence against the citizens, including getting a foreign nation army and inciting Native American violence. And number 4, he has ignored the repeated petitions of Congress to repair these other injustices. So in this way, Jefferson has set out to argue these are the things that George III has done, and it makes it necessary. It is our duty to rebel against these. Now, his claims are hyperbolic. He exaggerates a great deal, and they're somewhat ambiguous. He purposefully does not go into very specific detail. He leaves these claims somewhat broad, and this allows him, in just a single page, to make this declaration. What's interesting is that back in London, once they get the declaration, George III has one of his lawyers write a response to the Declaration of Independence. It takes that lawyer over 100 pages to answer the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson purposefully is vague, he's a little bit ambiguous, but he makes his argument. And this section ends by indicating that Americans deem the British enemies while at war, but friends when at peace. And the conclusion of the Declaration is absolute mastery. Congress says, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." And he concludes with, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Lives, fortunes, honor. They were effectively saying, we pledge everything to these new United States. The Declaration is one of the most powerful and beautiful pieces of political writing in the Western world. And with this declaration, Congress had not only impressively severed themselves from Britain, but had also justified the American Revolution. They had a right and a duty to create a new nation. That same document would be summoned many times over our history. Abraham Lincoln would bring it up during the Civil War. The movement for women's rights would rely on the Declaration of Independence. And the rights of African Americans, the ending of slavery, and also their ability to vote would once again bring up the Declaration of Independence. And it has been brought up across the globe as well, one of the most beautiful documents in the West.